Mexico City in 1910 was a beautiful place in the center. It had tree-lined boulevards, statues, fountains, a grand opera house, streetcars, elegant department stores. Europeans called it the Paris of the New World. But a 45-minute walk in any direction from the Zocalo in the center would show a very different Mexico City. Hordes of uprooted farmers and shacks made from trash, no water, sewer, toilets. Half the babies born there died before their birthday. This was the stratified world of Mexico after the Porfiriato. Twice a day, Porfirio Diaz would ride down the Paseo de la Reforma to the National Palace on the Zocalo. Police would carefully clear away the streets of beggars. He had recently celebrated his 80th birthday party. It was paid for by the state. Many foreign leaders came. It cost 20 million pesos. That was double the school budget for that year. In 1908, Diaz gave an interview to an American journalist named James Creelman, indicating that he might retire at the end of his next term in 1910. This was, of course, created a huge stir and excited a lot of intellectuals and others who would like to see Diaz step down. Now, by 1910, Diaz acted as if he never gave that interview. He stood for re-election and suppressed rival parties with his customary harshness. He was telling American audiences in 1908 what they wanted to hear, but he nevertheless aroused the hopes of intellectuals, labor leaders, and journalists. They searched for a candidate bold enough to stand and found him in Coahuila, Francisco Madero. Now, he was a rich man, a hacendado, one of the wealthiest men in Mexico. His grandfather was the state governor of Coahuila. He was a Diaz ally. But Francisco was very concerned with the poor. He was 5'2" and very thin. He had a squeaky bird-like voice. He did not smoke tobacco or drink alcohol. He was a vegetarian and a spiritualist. In short, he had no machismo, which would be a problem. Diaz called him the little bird. In 1910, his campaign, however, gained momentum. Intellectuals, the middle class, debt-ridden farm workers supported him, and so Diaz put him in jail. Election day, June 21st, saw Diaz win a huge majority, big shock. The only suspense was who he would pick for his vice president. Would it be Limantour? No, he picked Ramon Corral, who was known as the most hated man in Mexico. He made a fortune selling yaquis into slavery and labor camps. Diaz probably picked him as a form of life insurance. In September, a great celebration began in Mexico City. The independence, the centennial of Mexico City. And Diaz, interestingly, received no applause at the Independence Day parade. Reminds me of Grant receiving no applause at the centennial, as recorded in the novel 1876. After the celebration, Diaz released Madero, but forbade him to leave the town of San Luis Potosi in northern Mexico. Madero had already decided that only revolution could topple Diaz because he would cheat on elections. He hoped it would be short with minimal bloodshed. His supporters smuggled him out of Mexico to Laredo, Texas, where he issued the Plan of San Luis Potosi. This was the first of many plans issued by revolutionaries to take Mexico to a new era. He declared Diaz's election illegal and called for revolution to begin on November 20th to demand he step down. Nothing really happened on November 20th. But sort of coinciding with the Plan of San Luis Potosi, resistance movements had already sprung up in the North and the South. They were anti-rich rather than pro-Madero. In Chihuahua, the cattle rustler and bandit chief Pancho Villa began a series of raids on wealthy cattle ranches. His followers were landless Indians and underpaid mestizo miners who hated the rich. He portrayed himself as a Robin Hood, and he financed his revolution by buying guns with proceeds from cattle rustling. In the South, in Morelos, a farm worker revolt had begun under the leadership of Emiliano Zapata. These were campesinos, peasants, rural laborers who followed him, and they wanted their land back. They would storm haciendas, steal cattle and horses. Both of these movements initially appeared to be minor movements that would soon die out, but they quickly grew in armed force and military spirit. They were known as the Villistas and the Zapatistas, and this was as much a conflict of personalities as ideology. Diaz sent armies to Chihuahua and Morelos to suppress the rebels, but the rebels' hit-and-run methods made it difficult to engage them. In Morelos particularly, it was an insurgency-type war, and the Zapatistas began to control and defend large amounts of land, and the government was basically forced to flee. Now in the north, Villa captured the city of Chihuahua. This was an important railroad center, and this allowed the return of Madero from Texas to Mexico, where he met with Villa, and they formed an ironic alliance that developed a true friendship, apparently, based on mutual respect. Villa saw the need for a political and intellectual leader, and Madero needed Villa's military skill, and he saw that and ignored stories about Villa's cruelty, and ultimately he really could not control him, but they seemed to have a genuine respect for each other. At the border city of Ciudad Juarez, or Juarez City, named, of course, after the great liberal leader, Villa got into a bloody battle with the Federal Army defenders. Lacking modern weapons, he dynamited buildings to clear the way for his advance. Americans in El Paso, right across the river, stood on their rooftops to watch the battle. Several were actually wounded. On May 10th, 1911, the Federal commander surrendered. Villa would have executed him, but Madero got him across the border. Now, Ciudad Juarez was a major victory. The revolutionaries could now supply their forces with guns purchased in America. The revolution began to grow. Diaz couldn't understand his army's lack of success. He threatened to take command himself, even though he was 81 years old. He was worried and frustrated that they couldn't subdue what he saw as bandits. While he fussed over, military details, the day-to-day governing fell to Limantour, who was a realist who shunned military adventures. In addition to Zapata and Villa Madero, angry crowds gathered in the Zocalo every evening, where Limantour in the National Palace heard them shout, "Death to Diaz." Limantour, therefore, sent an emissary to Madero asking him for terms of peace. The representative of Madero met in Ciudad Juarez on May 21st and signed an agreement. The agreement stated that Diaz and Limantour would resign. Corral had already fled. The Mexican ambassador to the U.S., Francisco León de la Barra, would be an interim president until elections, which would clearly favor Madero, could be held. Crowds gathered in the Zocalo to celebrate and call for his immediate resignation, Diaz's that is. They were fired on by federal troops and 200 were killed. But on May 26, Diaz and his wife left by railroad to Veracruz, where they boarded a ship for France, where he died 4 years later. It's ironic. His reputation was built on fighting French. He was quoted as saying, "They have unleashed dangers they will not be able to control." Madero entered Mexico City in June to exultant crowds, screaming "Viva la Revolucion, Viva Madero," and when he stepped from the train, an earthquake struck. This was a mystic signal for Indians. It meant the violence wasn't over. But in early 1911, Madero was the most popular man in Mexico. He could have just taken over the office of president, but was insistent on having elections. The elections were scheduled for October. June to October was rather uneasy. Interim President de la Barra ordered the rebels to disarm, but most did not. Madero won 90% of the votes in October and chose Jose Maria Pino Suarez as vice president. They were sworn in November 6, 1911. At last, we had a freely elected president and vice president. But Madero was unable to govern. The campesinos demanded land. The hacendados refused to give up that land. The laborers in the cities demanded a living wage. Businesses ignored them. Madero offered only philosophy. He believed his one overriding job was to make Mexico a democracy. The Mexicans wanted more than democracy. They wanted food. Once democracy was fully established, Madero believed, mutual agreements would settle all other problems. Quote, "The Mexican people are not asking me for bread, they are asking me for liberty," he told a reporter. He talked about reforms such as land redistribution, but rarely was able to do anything. For example, he turned the land question over to a commission of congressmen, but they never issued a significant report. Hacendados, mine owners, foreign businessmen labeled him a radical. So he was caught between the right and the left and lost much of his support in a matter of months. The Mexico City press took delight in bashing him. Liberals accused him of sitting on his hands regarding the land issue, and conservatives denounced him as anti-business. It was ironic because Madero had lifted the censorship of the Diaz years, yet the press attacked him. His brother Gustavo said, "They are biting the hand that has removed the muzzle." And so the status of the campesinos was exactly the same under Madero as it was under Diaz. Zapata especially rejected this. Let's talk about Zapata for a minute. He was born in the heart of Morelos from a poor but respected family in a village of 400. He was mostly Indian blood. At the age of 9, he'd witnessed the leveling of an entire neighborhood of the village by the hacienda owner to make way for grazing land for his horses. He found his father weeping over the ruins of the neighborhood chapel. He failed to understand why his father and others didn't fight this. He had amazing horsemanship. He worked for a while as a trick rider with a rodeo. This took him to Mexico City, which seemed like the moon to him, an alien place for a country boy. When he returned, he would see the hacienda grow and the ejido shrink. And by his 20s, the local campesinos were sharecroppers on land they had once owned. In 1909, Zapata was chosen to go see the governor of Morelos to ask for help reclaiming the land. The governor refused to talk to him, and the mere attempt so infuriated the hacendado that he forbade the villagers the use of his land, even as sharecroppers. This incident convinced Zapata that the landowners would never peacefully return the stolen land. So he became a revolutionary, ultimately the most respected one. He had the strength of Villa and the idealism of Madero. He began a great hacienda war. He attacked them, stealing horses, guns, and cash. He was bold and inventive as a military leader. The government, first under Diaz and then de la Barra, sent federal armies to crush him, but when they could not find the Zapatistas, they would torture and hang suspected Zapatistas. "If they resist me, I shall hang them like earrings from the trees," a general, Juvencio Robles, had said. When Zapata took over Hacienda, he parceled out the land to local people and protected them from government soldiers. Often his supporters, male and female, worked the land with rifles slung over their shoulders. And as his movement grew, his peasant army took over scores of haciendas in several small cities. Now, on 2 occasions before he became president, Madero met with Zapata. Madero was horrified by the brutality of the Hacienda War, and while he agreed to land redistribution in theory, he felt the hacienda owners should be paid. Remember, he was one. By the time Madero was sworn in, Zapata had declared him an enemy of the revolution, had given up on Madero. Then on November 27th, 1911, Zapata makes a grand gesture. He issues the very famous Plan of Ayala, which basically says we're going to have land redistribution by force. Because Madero could not stop the Hacienda War, the Mexico City press branded him a coward. Here again we see this issue of lack of machismo. But ironically, the press longed for the order and stability of the Diaz era. Ironic because the Diaz era had suppressed the press. U.S. Ambassador Henry Lane Wilson was also a problem for Madero. He thought Madero was a dangerous radical. He was furious when Madero put a tax on oil companies to fund public education in Mexico. He prejudiced President Taft against Madero. Now, with Madero's popularity decreasing and his enemies growing, ambitious men began to plot to overthrow him. The most dangerous was Pascual Orozco, a one-time ally of Villa. In March of 1912, he began a rebellion. He had a well-equipped army of 6,000 men, and he was backed, strangely, by the Terrazas and Creole families of northern Mexico. They feared what Madero might do one day to implement his ideas on land redistribution. Orozco hoped to march south to Mexico City, gathering followers as he went. He had a bloody beginning in Chihuahua. Orozco sent a dynamite-loaded train headlong into a train with federal troops. Most were killed. Now, to suppress Orozco, Madero turned to General Victoriano Huerta, a great mistake. Huerta was brutal but effective. He's a hard drinker and a drug user who routinely stole army funds. Madero was reluctant to use him, but he felt he must. He authorized him to lead a large army and gave him a large budget. After several battles, Huerta routed Orozco, who fled to Texas. The campaign seemed easy, and Madero asked him to account for this giant budget, which had disappeared, and Huerta said, "I am a soldier, not a bookkeeper."